Welcome back to Out of the Ground, reading the Book of Dust by Philip Pullman. This is Wesley Shantz. I've got a sleeping baby, so it must be time for another episode. This is the fifth in our series of discussions, covering this time chapters 6, Glazing Sprigs, and 7, Too Soon, in La Belle Sauvage. And I call this episode The Teacher's Despair. It's a phrase that jumped out to me, perhaps hitting too close to home, and it certainly helps to capture some of the difficulties of these series of chapters as we've had the world and the characters established. A few important events take place, and we enter a kind of dull section in which the rising action begins to build. Realistically dull, because of the focus on Malcolm's school life and because of the changes taking place in his society that are manifested even there. And I think that some of this also must come out of Philip Pullman's own experience of teaching in middle schools and in teacher college settings in and around Oxford over many years. He writes a little bit about this in one of his essays called Let's Write It in Red. He describes riding a train and seeing a group of children. I think some of them were cousins. There was a baby who was being fed, and there was a 4-year-old with a huge bag of crisps, so they were happily occupied. And there were 2 boys of roughly 11 who were swapping football stickers, so they were all right. And there were 2 girls, I guess about 8 or 9, who didn't have anything to do and who were a bit restless. So the mother gave them some colored pencils and a pad of paper and said, "Why don't you write a story?" My eyes were firmly fixed on what I was reading, namely the papers concerning the Center for the Children's Book, now known as 7 Stories, which was what I was going to Newcastle for. But the magpie who sits in every storyteller's head turned his beady-eyed attention at once to what the girls were doing. "What can we steal from this?" he said. "What can we copy? What can we use?" Actually, the roosting space in my head is shared between the magpie and another bird, that dusty, broken-down, out-of-date old owl who used to be a teacher. And he opened an eye too, and cocked an ear, if owls can do that, to see what these girls had been taught. And it goes on. It's pretty interesting to reflect on the ways in which Pullman's experience teaching, which for him largely entailed telling stories at the time, has impacted not just his students over all those years, but all of us who then come to his stories now and benefit from those years of honing his craft in the School of Hard Knocks. He opens this chapter 6, Glazing Sprigs, with Malcolm talking to his parents about the scholar that he's met and the books that he's borrowed from her. And he tells us that he hides the most important thing of all, namely his work as a spy for Hannah Relf. The way in which he is and is not able to talk to his parents about things becomes really important here, and the presence of Hannah in his life as someone else that he can talk to becomes really significant. I think that her standing in for a trusted teacher is a pretty clear transformation that we can see taking place in the story now. The books, of course, were given to him last time, but here they are named. So his mother reads the titles without any apparent recognition, but perhaps with some admiration for her boy. It's The Body in the Library and A Brief History of Time. Her only comment is that he better keep them out of the kitchen so they don't get grease on them. from the lamb stew, and they began to talk about his future, continuation of the conversation he was having with Hannah Ralph. But she kind of shuts down the conversation because she's focused on cooking. The suggestion she gives is to ask his father. But all that she suspects he would say is to eat your stew. So the question's open. Will Malcolm go on to senior school, or will he become an innkeeper or an apprentice? In his mind, that seems like the more likely route. But suddenly, his ideas are opening, broadening, changing. And this is a key moment in everyone's life, of course, when sooner or later, usually around the time of adolescence, we begin to think new thoughts, feel new feelings, have new desires, have new anxieties, and begin to wonder in a bit of more immediate way what sort of person we're going to become. Now, the tradition of the novel includes a very important branch, namely the Bildungsroman, or novel of education. It's one that Pullman excels in, along with his interest in more action-packed and detective elements. There's always a strong thread of the Bildungsroman to his work. We see this with Lyra in The Golden Compass and her other books, and we see it very much with Malcolm here. And once again, it's very interesting to contrast and compare the two characters. Lyra's education, as far as formal education goes, is relatively sparse. We see bits and snatches of it here and there, but mostly her education comes in the form of her interactions with other people in the real world. Her knowledge and pride in the scholars of Jordan is a core part of her identity, of course, but she really doesn't pay much attention to what they say. She holds on to things that they might not expect, though, like about dust and elementary particles. Notice it was a dusty old bird. That can't be accidental in Pullman's retelling of the story on the train. And that train, I think it becomes one of the most important images in the continuation of Lyra's story in The Secret Commonwealth. There's a couple of crucial, unforgettable, very troubling, in some cases, scenes that take place on trains. Her receiving of the Miriorama cards seems to be mapped very closely onto that experience he's describing. And then the attempted rape that happens a bit later in the story is also a kind of version of the worst possible outcome of a train ride. And the story, when it gets to that part, is very difficult for many readers, understandably. But I think it gets foreshadowed here a little bit because the next thing that we hear about is a bit of education for Malcolm, which takes place in the inn. Now, he's just minding his own business, but happens to notice that Alice, as she's reaching forward to put some glasses down, is pinched on the bottom by one of the customers, a farmer named Arnold Helmsley. And the fact that Malcolm simply observes this and doesn't intervene is, I think, understandable again, but doesn't reflect terribly well on him or his upbringing. It's the kind of thing that in a later time in another place would be a kind of negligence if he wasn't to speak up. But in his setting, it is rather quickly passed over. And Alice's response, while very telling of her true character, is a little bit difficult for him to understand in this moment. She responds by asking if which of the men did it, and when they meet her with silence, she shatters one of the glasses and threatens to strike them with it the next time it happens, indiscriminately, not asking who did it. When Malcolm's father asks what happened, all she says is that someone made a mistake. Now, maybe because she does know, or maybe because it's a way for poetic justice to be done, she tosses the broken glass, and it's Arnold who catches it and cuts himself on it. Their response is to discuss the event in a jumbled series of comments, the upshot of which is that she's too young, she wasn't provoking him, and after all, she's old Tony Parslow's girl. So there's a degree of social stigma attached to this action, but it doesn't rise to the level of actual consequences. And that, I think, is something that Pullman wants the reader to think about and notice. And I think we have to notice that Malcolm is complicit in this by not saying anything, by not intervening, by not telling his father right away what actually happened. So the image of glass is going to be really important, as the title of the chapter suggests. But it's almost transparent, it's almost difficult to look at straight on. And we see that the conversation in the bar really quickly goes back into a different topic. Everyone wants to talk about the weather, the rain, and the floods. And this is where the story is heading inexorably, as we know from rereading. We have a couple new characters introduced here, a Mr. Anscombe, a Dougie, people who are talking about the history and the cyclical nature of the floods. Every 50 years or so, with the last having occurred in 52 or 53, they aren't sure, and before that in 1883. This tells us that we're right around 1990 or so. Other clues that we'll get later in other places push that a little bit earlier to, say, the mid-80s. But the men have all sorts of good ideas about this. Ways to fix this problem include building or maintaining the reservoirs better, dredging the river out proper. They argue a little bit comically over whether the water is a precious resource after all. It would be in the Sahara, but it's not exactly in short supply in England. They name a few of the nearby towns and geographical features, Abingdon, the Chilterns. And we also should be thinking, as readers of the Golden Compass, of Lord Asriel now and his intervention in the previous flood. This is mentioned and helps us get a little bit of a handle on timeline by Father Coram and John Fa in about the same place in the Golden Compass, chapters 7 and 8 or so. So the story about Lyra is a bit different there. Either John Fa isn't telling her the whole story, or he has it a bit muddled. Of course, in terms of the creating or crafting of the story, Pullman doesn't necessarily know all this about La Belle Sauvage at the time. So here's what he says. The court decided you, Lyra, was to be placed in a priory, and so you were, with the Sisters of Obedience at Watlington. I think we'll meet them a bit later. You won't remember, but Lord Asriel wouldn't stand for that. He had a hatred of priors and monks and nuns, and being a high-handed man, he just rode in one day and carried you off. Not to look after himself, nor to give to the Egyptians. He took you to Jordan College and dared the law to undo it. Well, the law let things be. Lord Asriel went back to his explorations, and you grew up at Jordan College. The one thing he said, your father, the one condition he made was that your mother shouldn't be let see you. So then we get in chapter 8. For them as has forgotten, it were Lord Asriel who interceded with the Turk for the life of San Brokman. It were Lord Asriel who allowed Egyptian boats free passage to the canals through his property. It were Lord Asriel who defeated the Watercourse Bill in Parliament to our great and lasting benefit. And it were Lord Asriel who fought day and night in the floods of '53, and plunged headlong in the water twice to pull out young Rude and Nellie Koopman. So again, that doesn't quite line up with our chronology here, I think. We probably want to adjust that floods of '53 to be brought up to the floods of, say, '86, '87, something like that. Unless Asriel is a good deal older than he appears, or he was very young, maybe Malcolm's age or so, when he lived through the prior flood in '53. Anyhow, that would be an interesting story to hear more about, but we don't. Instead, as I say, these chapters mostly focus on Malcolm and his school, Wolvercott Elementary. And with the rain, this is where we get the phrase, the teachers despair. The kids are not allowed to play outside at recess. They have to be stuck indoors. Everyone becomes fretful. It's dull. The time passes slowly. So Malcolm and his friends play table football, and the demon of one of his friends, Eric, has some important news. This is mysterious, this is tantalizing, forbidden perhaps, but they're not trying very hard to suppress it. This is a pretty interesting characterization here of a kid who just can't keep secrets. And it runs in the family, evidently, because it's his father, the court clerk, who has told him some things that aren't strictly legal for him to share. But of course he does. He mentions that, well, that man who was drowned turns out not to have drowned at all, but to have been strangled and thrown in the river or the canal. There's some evidence to support this about the marks on his neck, no water in his lungs. It's rather graphic and rather like a kind of detective story. Now, there's also a important dynamic at play wherein, while he makes a show of secrecy and mystery, really what he wants most of all is to get to tell. And this will be emphasized a bit more later. But I think it's an important part of storytelling that we might not always associate with Pullman. Elsewhere, storytelling is a very positive and almost life-giving, certainly life-affirming activity. But in places where he talks about fantasy, for instance, where he talks about C.S. Lewis and his treatment of Susan, where he talks about the kinds of lies that Lyra told up until she comes to the world of the dead, there is also this element of storytelling which is distinctly negative. It can get people into trouble, it can be dangerous, it can be destructive. I think that's important to bear in mind when so much of this second trilogy seems to be about complicating and showing in their true complexity some of the aspects of religion, and here of storytelling, of education perhaps, that were a little bit less ambiguous, more sharply defined in the original trilogy. So there's no mention in the newspaper. Is it being censored? Is it just not public knowledge? But at any rate, Malcolm, of course, has his books to read as well. He finds the body in the library, in contrast to the body in the canal, to be something that he can't stop reading about. He finishes it long after his light was supposed to be out. And we're told that he begins to think a little bit more deeply about what he witnessed that day. And just as he didn't speak up to offer to help or intervene with Alice, his failure to help the man who was later killed, begins to haunt him. That connection is not made explicitly in the story, but I think, again, for readers, it's something that's going to be important for us to notice. Malcolm observes, he listens, but he doesn't always speak up. He doesn't always say what he knows when it could help someone else. This is an important aspect of his character that we want to see transform, grow over the course of the story. And of course, he can rationalize with himself that perhaps it wouldn't have made a difference. Perhaps he would have put himself in danger by doing anything about it. The CCD might have been watching anyway. And this is a little bit of a preview of the kind of alternate worlds that Pullman is so fond of conjuring and exploring. But ultimately, what really bothers Malcolm is the loneliness of the man's death. Something about that, his lack of having a friend, an advocate, someone with him, is what really upsets our young protagonist. So he wants to see Lyra at the Priory, but he can't. He wants to give her a present, but he supposes that he'll wait until he can see her to do so. He finds out that it was indeed the Lord Chancellor himself whose decision it was to bring Lyra here. He questions a bit further, is that really the Lord Chancellor's job? There must be loads of babies. And maybe we could think of the famous interaction with King Solomon and the two women claiming the same child. Is that really the job of the government to descend to those details? Maybe it is, if it's a wise government. He is told about the importance of Lyra's parents. Again, it's emphasized how confidential and certainly private that this information is meant to be, but of course everyone already knows. And while she says everything is fine and she never lies, Malcolm can see that Sister Benedicta isn't telling him the whole truth because there is something up. The nuns are nervous, and as he goes out into the rain, he sees the warm light in the workshop. So he goes to talk to Mr. Taphouse the carpenter. Sees that he's making shutters. So again, this theme of glass comes back. Heavy oak shutters. The craftsmanship of the acorn is going to be recapitulated here in the construction of something to protect the nuns and their precious guest. The old man gives him a wink and shows him an amberic, that is electric, drill. It's going to allow him to put up the fittings that will hold this heavy shutter right on the stone outside the windows. Malcolm can only help at first by sweeping up, but he's okay. The act of sweeping is one that Pullman is fascinated by. He has Lyra learn the proper way to sweep up on the ship in her story, and here Malcolm, of course, practical that he is, already knows. He continues asking, but he doesn't get much more information from Mr. Taphouse, who, though he wonders what's going on, never asks more than the nuns tell him. It seems they think the stained glass windows are too precious, and so they don't bother covering those. And I find that really interesting, that beauty is its own kind of protection, at least in the minds of people who have a certain belief in that power of beauty. The other question that he asks about who they're trying to be protected from is apparently getting into dangerous territory. We've been told that someone among the religious authorities wants to kill Lyra, but we don't know exactly who our suspect is at this point. We don't know exactly why it's dangerous to ask. But Mr. Taphouse says no more. His woodpecker Daemon clacks her beak, and it's a little bit reminiscent of the terrible birds in the world of the Mulefa. Certainly that discussion is closed, and all that we can learn is that Lord Asriel himself has been a nuisance to the church in the past. So that at least is consistent across the whole trilogy, or the two separate trilogies. We see another image of fire here, the casting of the excess wood into the stove. So, as much as he liked The Body in the Library and couldn't stop reading it, he finds his other book, A Brief History of Time, to be more difficult. But he expected that, and so he's excited to do his best to finish it, and almost manages it by the time it's Saturday again, and his second, I think, Saturday meeting with Hannah Ralph. Lo and behold, she also is fiddling with a pane of glass that's broken. This is where the Glazing Sprigs of the chapter title come in. So Malcolm, being a practical and observant young fellow, has watched the process of fixing a broken glass. He goes and gets the necessary screws, or sprigs, rather. He shows a trick with the hammer and chisel to knock them in without breaking the glass, and allows Hannah Ralph to have a turn once she's seen how to do it. And then they add the putty, and it'll dry, and they can paint it, and it'll be perfectly neat. So his craftsmanship is rising to that level that he so admires. And then they have their customary cioccolato. They have a discussion now about, first, what he's observed, and he wonders if he's asked the right questions, because he didn't find out if some window had been broken, actually. But just what they told him, that there were burglars, and perhaps it's coming back to the baby Lyra, because it was Lord Nugent, a very important person after all, who decided to put her there. He also tells her about the man in the canal. This elicits the exclamation, "Good God!" He wonders if his friend was exaggerating, but after all, the man is dead, and so those emotions start to come out. And so there's a mixture of embarrassment, awkwardness, a contrast between his mother, who knows how to comfort someone who's crying, and Hannah Ralph, who doesn't seem to know what to do. Not that he wanted her to embrace him and comfort him in that way, but all the same, it's awkward. And this is very reminiscent of some scenes with Will and Mrs. Coulter and Mary Malone. The dynamics of saving face, of expressing emotion and concealing it, are all very carefully expressed and wound into those interactions. So, in short, we come back around to Hannah Ralph's guilt for involving Malcolm in this way, and his determination to continue to help all the same, despite the danger. They shift to talking about the books now, and the contrast is pursued here between what it's like to have a tutorial discussion of this kind and what Malcolm has experienced talking to friends on the one hand, or in the class of 40 at school on the other. And so the kind of discussion of books that takes place here seems to be a kind of model or vision of what's possible when people have the time, the inclination, and the knowledge to have a really good conversation. It's the kind of thing that I think many of us are grateful for if we do get to experience it, and others perhaps don't even know what they're missing if they don't. So I wonder again about the way in which Pullman's stories are meant not just to represent a process of education or Bildungsroman, but also to be an invitation to the reader to participate in and experience a truly liberal education. So they're talking about The Body in the Library, this classic of the detective story genre, one which is kind of interesting in some ways as well. If you read it, you'll see um, that very early on, this association between the dead body and the books and the library is more than just a kind of generic setting, but really there's a kind of referential nature to the kind of thing that happens in books and the kind of thing that is happening in the story. The characters make reference to um, Agatha Christie herself and her books. Um, they talk about how what's happening is like what happens in detective stories. Um, Now, this is a Miss Marple story, and so her power of seeing likenesses and drawing connections from her experience in practical real life, and then how that reflects on the police investigation, is of course very close to the core of the book. She's a really interesting detective, and the imagery that goes along with this, there's discussions of some of these characters as being sort of amateurs, and of course she describes herself as an amateur when it comes to solving crimes. Um, One of the characters is described like a fairy godfather, and there is a dismissal of the possibility that the killer is mad because that's, after all, too easy. It's one of the worst things that you can do in the discussion of a book, to say that a character is just crazy, because it shuts down discussion. Um, and then there's a lot of conversation about human nature. The Book of Ruth is referenced. There is a discussion of what people say and do to justify their very worst actions, when they can say that what they're doing is for love. That makes things much more complicated. And we have a kind of doubling that happens, where what seems to be a single crime is wrapped in with something much larger. A kind of sickness in the society as a whole is touched on, though very delicately there. And then there's the brief history of time. Now, this one they don't fully discuss. It seems that neither of them, or certainly at least Malcolm, doesn't really understand the book well enough, and I can totally see how that would happen, because even at my advanced age, when I tried to read this, I didn't get a whole lot out of it, or at least I would have to go back and read it much more closely. But it's a wonderful book, one that gives a kind of big picture vision of what the cosmos is, the universe, and the nature of space and time. It's written in a very accessible way, still I think a little bit beyond most 11-year-olds, but after all, it gives a kind of overview that is quite valuable. Discussions of the Ptolemaic versus Copernican systems of the world, ways of defining what events really are as a kind of intersection of different possibilities and paths that things could be on. The very famous story, one of the first things in the book, is given of Bertrand Russell and his audience member, who tells him that, as clever as his explanation of the universe is, the world is held on the back of a turtle, and what's under the turtle is another turtle, and it's turtles all the way down. There is also a beginning of the discussion of the quantum introduced here that is going to be the subject of the next nonfiction book that Malcolm borrows. So we'll come back to that a bit later here. But I think the most interesting thing that we get here in Stephen Hawking's book is the mention of uh, the real and the imaginary, the way that information itself can be carried by light and in other ways, and how this can and cannot escape the pool of gravity, of entropy, the thermodynamic heat death that is inevitable, and the arrow of time that goes only one way. Now, he talks about this in terms of physics, but also in terms of psychology. In some interesting ways, Hawking is really insightful about human nature, just like Agatha Christie is. And I think that is the surprising connection for me between these two books that are the first ones Pullman has Malcolm choose from Hannah Relf's library. So that's the sort of discussion I guess they must have had. It seems to have a very powerful impact on Malcolm, and it seems to be very satisfying for Hannah Relf herself to allow him this access to her library, the freedom to choose books. Um, so again, the next that he chooses from the Agatha Christie's is not named, but there is an interesting mention here of what's good about those books is not the way that they stay in one's memory, but the way one can forget them and can read them again. So they're good, but not in the way a memorable classic or work of art is. Um, they're classic in their own way. They also talk about how her work as a historian of ideas allows her to ask these big questions about why things exist at all. And Malcolm, kind of channeling Mr. Taphouse here, has never even thought to ask that, much as he might wonder if it's something he can even wrap his head around. He thought things just were. And although it might be dangerous to discuss some of this, if they stick to what's published, she thinks they'll be okay. So this comes back to the idea of censorship and its kind of evil twin, propaganda. There is an important work by John Milton on the subject. I think it's called Areopagitica, which I haven't read, but I assume that Pullman is including these conversations because he too is very interested in the freedom of ideas and of readers to make up their own minds. Now, there is a title given for the second book. Again, though we don't know what detective story he takes, Malcolm does take The Strange Story of the Quantum. And that is a fascinating book. It exists in our universe by Banesh Hoffman, someone who collaborated with Einstein himself. And the writing style there is much more flowery, ornate, rhetorical. And it is well worth reading, but it is quite a difficult book. I think a bit more more advanced than Hawking's style. So there is at no point in their conversation do the characters actually make the connection between what's going on at the Priory, the putting up the shutters, and the broken window at Hannah Relf's house. I think that is conspicuous by its absence. That coincidence being unremarked by the characters should certainly not escape the reader. And we should wonder again about Malcolm's ability to ask the right questions and reflect on ourselves. Are we doing that? This was in the previous couple of chapters, that idea of asking perceptive questions that is associated with Mrs. Coulter, but also the skill of Farquharm directing the conversation to the information that he really needs. So those are the glasses in this chapter, the Glazing Sprigs. What's left is a little coda in which we see Hannah Relf drop a note at the Porter's Lodge at Jordan. And this is where George Papadimitriou, the scholar of Byzantine history, who recruited her for her work with Oakley Street, comes to discuss the events, the death of her insulator, the story that she has gotten via Malcolm, and importantly, her involvement with Malcolm and her involving him in the dangerous work of the Secret Service. So again, they remark that he's very curious. This is a great asset to them. George Papadimitriou, that is, notices that he was the very boy who was serving them at the Trout that night. And so we kind of come full circle in a way. So the scholar himself learns a lesson from Malcolm to be more careful, I suppose, or to be more respectful of their listeners. And there's a little bit of psychologizing here that maybe why Malcolm is so interested in Lyra is because he's an only child. He's certainly fascinated by the baby in a way that the baby's own parents are evidently not concerned about her welfare. And we get a question, a little bit of intrigue about who that third man was at the Trout. Pullman himself, again, may not even know yet. He may be putting down some threads that might be useful to him to pick up later, should he require it. But there's a bit more tradecraft here. We're told that the porter at Jordan is a gossip, again, a carrier of tales, a tale teller. And so instead of using that method, she should light a candle and hold up, or rather, put up a card that says the word candle on it. And this will tell him that they need to meet. They'll do so under the music at Wickham during evensong. He doesn't chastise her, but tells her that she has done well to recruit the boy. And as she's going to hear a number of times here, she needs to look after him. Okay, this brings us to chapter 7. Too soon. It's a very short chapter. We carry on this discussion of Oakley Street and the ins and outs of how it works, which are a little bit difficult to parse. She has another way to contact them, which is via the librarian at Oxford. And so because she is in need of a new insulator, she goes to this particular cataloger and puts in a request for a particular book number. Perhaps it's that book that was hollowed out to hide the alethiometer originally. This includes also the topic of her request, and it allows Harry Dibdin and his tropical bird demon to address the issue. His name may allude to someone who was one of the so-called first book club, according to a Wikipedia article, the Roxburgh Club, founded in 1812. Or it could just be a coincidence. So they discuss the murder. They discuss her work with the alethiometer. They talk a little bit about the way in which messages were passed, these left luggage boxes, so-called. And he doesn't want to know too much. Again, even the fact that she knows who he is seems to be a bit dangerous. And the fact that she knows about Thomas Nugent's involvement is extremely surprising to him. When she asks about the significance of the child, he tries to make it seem like they are not connected at all. But of course, it's obvious that they are. She resolves to never mention Oakley Street to Malcolm. And she tries to process the guilt that she's feeling. This is going to be the big theme of the next couple of chapters as well. Meanwhile, he's very happily working on putting up the shutters, gets to try out the powerful drill, gets to build more with Mr. Taphouse using this costly oak. But after all, you get what you pay for. They get to exchange the phrase that things are only as strong as the fixing. And so their interaction is a kind of mirror image of Malcolm's with Hannah. It's the kind of conversation, the kind of work that he can do with this older, trusted adult that's very valuable for him and for his education. he has an idea now. He wants to make it possible to screw in but not unscrew these shutters to make them extra protected. Um, and when he shares this idea that by filing the head, they could be screwed in but not unscrewed, his mentor says it's a good idea, but what happens if the sisters change their mind and they ask him to pull down the shutters? They're going to be in a bind. Now, Malcolm is not put out by this. He resolves to keep thinking about it and improve his idea. And they move on to talking about something quite interesting. Again, this looks like a seed of an idea that might have been dropped, but the idea that Danish oil will spontaneously combust if left without soaking. The word itself, the phrase spontaneous combustion, gives Malcolm pleasure to learn and to say. And so again, that combination of pleasure, aesthetic, richness, beauty with learning, with security and safety is brought to the fore. Now, he gets to talk to Fenella again, and he's quite insistent on seeing the baby. But first he works up to that by asking, again, why they're putting up these shutters. It was just some advice that the police gave them about burglars, whether it's about Lyra, and of course it will protect her, as well as all of their other precious silver vestments and such. And then when they do go in to see Lyra, it sounds like she is teaching her demon to talk. So this idea that education takes place within oneself, in a manner of speaking, as well as in interactions with other people, formal education settings, and the external world. And this is where play is so important. That essay of Pullman's, let's write it in red, is in a way circling around the idea of telling stories as a kind of play. And what Malcolm has to give Lyra is a toy. It's a ball on a lanyard that he's been patiently working on when he couldn't paint his boat, when he couldn't read back and forth in his books anymore earlier. We're told that he was plying together that lanyard, and here's what it's for. It's to hold this smooth ball of beechwood that he didn't paint because he knows that wouldn't have been safe. And so we get a kind of amusing combination of practicality on Malcolm's part and also delightful unconsciousness and ignorance. Again, what he thinks is safe is terrifyingly dangerous for the baby because if she swallows the lanyard, you can pull it out. The ball's too big. Even his demon in this moment makes it clear to him it's not safe. And this is where the title of this chapter, Too Soon, seems to come in. There's a really interesting bit of interaction here where he does get to hold the baby for the first time. He makes her laugh again by pretending to have hiccups. And he thinks to himself that while Fenella's soft, bright voice is soothing, it's not the right way of speaking. It's not the best way of speaking to a baby. And so we get another longer passage, extended bit of dialogue from Malcolm himself, kind of like his flight of fancy about why the baby was brought there in the first place. But this time it's him talking to the infant Lyra, telling her how he's made this for her, but it's not safe for her yet, so she'll get it later. How he'll take her on a ride in the Belle Sauvage. And that's very true, more true than he knows. How they can make plans to have adventures for her to learn to swim and this and that. And this, again, seems pretty close to Pullman's own thoughts about the right way to talk to someone younger, even a baby. It's to do it in a storytelling sort of fashion, using lots of words and a tone of voice that shows that you respect their intelligence in a really deep way, and you want them to participate in this activity of learning right alongside you. So his apprenticeships to the inn, to the workshop, to the scholar, all sort of circle around and seem to inform Malcolm about not just how to learn, but how to teach as well, and how those things are closely related. Now we get a bit of foreshadowing here to what's going to be our immediate villain for the next few chapters, because there's voices in the hall. A harsh-faced woman with tightly wound buns of hair comes in wearing a kind of uniform of gray, and has a badge with a lamp flame on it. She says that this is not at all suitable, that this boy had better go home. Her harsh tone frightens the baby, and maybe it's even Benedicta who tells Malcolm that it's time to go home. She has to placate, navigate this situation, and he is a complicating factor here. Even Fenella seems quite startled and taken aback, and that's very sad, of course, but really the worst of all is the baby herself begins to wail properly. So again, this idea of having something to tell, and the way in which Malcolm gleans this information remains the kind of axis around which these chapters are revolving. He learns unexpectedly important things at school, of course, as well as desultorily settling down to French. But what he really is finding out is taking place in these other settings. And the kind of formal education that he's getting, while it's important, of course, is not of immediate significance alongside his relationships with the nuns, with the carpenter, the scholar, his parents, and so on, and particularly with the baby Lyra. So again, we could speculate on what this other book is that he's borrowed. I think it might be the book Poirot Investigates, so that we could get some Poirot in there, the other great detective invented by Agatha Christie. And particularly because that's where the Adventure of the Egyptian Tomb is first published in book form. That's the book, rather the story that Pullman includes from Agatha Christie in his Detective Stories edition. So maybe it's that. We're never told. We do know that he's got Banesh Hoffman's Strange Story of the Quantum, which is a real book, which you can read. It's fascinating. I looked up a little bit about him because I was curious how to pronounce his name. And what I saw on Wikipedia was that he has also got some books on the tyranny of testing, so on education. He was a member of the Baker Street Irregulars and wrote the story Sherlock, Shakespeare, and the Bomb, published in Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine in February 1966. So also an aficionado of detective stories. That is a wonderful book, by the way, The Strange Story of the Quantum, talking about discoveries and attempts to fashion a coherent theory. It's full of the excitement of learning, and it is quite impressionistic and rhetorical in places as well, even rising to a kind of religious ecstasy. Hoffman is quite a writer, as well as a very important scientist, right up there with Hawking, of course. And I forgot to mention, one of the people that's named in Hawking's acknowledgments is an Anne Relf. So I wonder if that is something that Pullman either consciously or unconsciously took and named his character after. For a bit more extra reading, you could look at Milton's Areopagitica, if you're feeling ambitious. You could also check out W.H. Auden on this idea of forgetting and then rereading detective stories. He has a piece in Harper's called The Guilty Vicarage, which is like a classic meditation on the detective story genre. So here's a little passage from the opening. For me, Auden writes, as for many others, the reading of detective stories is an addiction like tobacco or alcohol. The symptoms of this are, firstly, the intensity of the craving. Secondly, its specificity. And thirdly, its immediacy. I forget the story as soon as I have finished it and have no wish to read it again. If, as sometimes happens, I start reading one and find after a few pages I have read it before, I cannot go on. Such reactions convince me that, in my case at least, detective stories have nothing to do with works of art. It is possible, however, that an analysis of the detective story, that is, of the kind of detective story I enjoy, may throw light not only on its magical function, but also by contrast on the function of art. So if that doesn't make you want to read them, I don't know. I'll just give away the ending, though, because this is also very apropos to Philip Pullman's themes. The fantasy, then, which the detective story addict indulges is the fantasy of being restored to the Garden of Eden, to a state of innocence, where he may know love as love and not as the law. The driving force behind this daydream is the feeling of guilt, the cause of which is unknown to the dreamer. The fantasy of escape is the same, whether one explains the guilt in Christian, Freudian, or any other terms. One's way of trying to face the reality, on the other hand, will of course depend very much on one's creed. And it just ends. It's such a fascinating essay. Last but not least, apropos of Byzantine history, well, really more just the word Byzantine, I thought of that other poet who I get mixed up with W.H. Auden, W.B. Yeats. Yeats's Sailing to Byzantium is a beautiful poem that I have to imagine Pullman has on the brain here. It has themes of age and youth, of education, singing school, has some wonderful phrases, and it has the imagery of gold, which is going to be so important for Malcolm later in the Book of Dust. So probably I should have just read that one out loud too, but go on and find it and look it up and enjoy. Yeats, of course, one of the great interpreters and followers of William Blake, who is of extreme importance for Pullman as well. So that brings us to the end of another long-winded discourse on Philip Pullman's Book of Dust. I really appreciate those who are on this journey with me, and I look forward to hearing from you. Questions, comments, and suggestions are always welcome. I'll let you go for now. Take care.